All right, welcome to the final online lecture for Com 361 Media Law and Ethics. And this one is on what was called the PMRC, the Parents Music Resource Center. And this is kind of ties into our discussion talking about obscenity and indecency. And this happened back in the 1980s, in the mid 1980s. And it's just kind of an interesting period of time in popular culture. And I usually tack it on to the end of the indecency and obscenity section that we just completed. But in the interest of time, because we are running a little tight, I decided to do it here as a little online extra, if you will. And it basically centers around the fact that in the mid 1980s, popular music was becoming a little more sexually charged, a little bit more overtly sexually charged. And one of the main reasons for this, because if you listen to popular music, rock and roll, R&B, even old blues, the sexual innuendo was nothing new. Sex has always been part of popular music. But what changed in the 1980s, of course, was MTV. Now we had a visual representation to go along with this music. And oftentimes the videos were sexually charged. This was the time that Madonna was coming out and was very popular. This was the time that Prince was very popular and Rick James was very popular. And then you had your glam rock with all your LA rock and roll bands like Poison and Motley Crue. They had their Girls, Girls, Girls song, and the video takes place in a strip club. So there was this kind of ramping up, if you will, of just sexual overtones in music. And so the PMRC was created as a way to try to combat this. In fact, they were referred to as the Washington Wives. And right here you see Tipper Gore, which you may remember is now the ex-wife of Vice President Al Gore. And she was one of the founding members of the PMRC. Next to her is a woman named Susan Baker, whose husband at the time was working with the Reagan administration. He started off as chief of staff. At this particular point in time, he was the Secretary of Treasury. He also served as Secretary of State and also chief of staff under George Bush Sr. So very influential women. The two other wives, one was a city councilwoman's wife in Washington, D.C., and the other was the wife of a major real estate developer in the D.C. area. And so the PMRC was really trying to attack what they called porn rock. Again, these sexual overtones in popular music. But what's interesting about this is that the music that they were targeting wasn't what you might think as far as being offensive, because they weren't really going after more obscure artists. They were going after artists that were being played on the radio, that were being played on MTV. And so there was a little bit of a backlash, because a lot of people felt, well, this is top 40 radio music. What are they talking about? And these women were really, what they were trying to do, and we've seen this before in other areas, is trying to protect children mostly. And at the point where the PMRC was kind of happening, 1985, 1986, I was 10, 11 years old, and I distinctly remember the songs that they were talking about. They wanted to create a way to try to regulate even further music that was being played on the radio and trying to keep it out of children's hands. And so they created what they called the Filthy 15. It was a list of songs, and this is the Filthy 15 right here, that they kind of flagged as being songs that were troublesome and that parents needed to be aware of, that could be possibly damaging to their kids. And some of these songs were very popular at the time. Some of them not so much. I know Cyndi Lauper's She Bop was a huge song. Mary Jane Girls in My House was a huge song. I don't remember that particular Madonna song. The Twisted Sister, We're Not Gonna Take It song, that was really big. Some of these, the Prince song, Darling Nikki, was not a single. It was a very sexual song. It's on the Purple Rain album. It was not released as a single. Sheena Easton's Sugar Walls was. And then the Wasp song, obviously, this was not released as a single. They weren't going to play this on the radio. So how they created this list is kind of interesting because it is a mix between more popular songs that were being played on the radio and songs that were really more obscure and from artists that, quite frankly, I would expect to have more adult tinged language. So what I usually do when I do this part of the presentation in class is I play some examples of some of these songs. I'm not doing that because I'm going to load this video up to YouTube. I've had to start loading up to YouTube because there's not enough space in in Canvas for me to load the video straight into there. So I've included these links, and I'm going to include this PowerPoint in addition to this online lecture. And what I want you to do is I just want you to click on these and just watch the first minute of each one and just listen to the lyrics. And both of these songs kind of give you an idea of kind of the ridiculousness of what the PMRC was after, especially the Mary Jane Girl song. This is one of those songs that, I mean, you've got to really want to make it sexual in order for it to be sexual. Sugar Walls is a little more blatant, but still very innocent when it came out. So again, just follow these links and just listen to the first minute or so of each song to kind of give you an idea of what they were targeting, and also to see what was popular back in 1985. You might get a kick out of that. So what did the PMRC want? Well, they wanted to create several new policies. Now, they were not a governing body themselves. They were merely just a group of women who got together to try to create change. What they wanted to do was they wanted to get congressional support that would then create policies that would impact the recording industry. Some of the things that they wanted were a suggested rating system for music. And you have to think about the fact that music, even to this day, is the only major form of entertainment that does not have a rating system. We have a rating system for films. We have had for a very, very long time. I think 1968 was when the current rating system came out. We have a rating system for television shows on broadcast and even on cable, the TV 14, the TVMAs. We have rating systems for video games. But we don't have a rating system for music. So it is kind of interesting to think that is the one area where we don't really have a type of rating system that kind of lets us know how serious and how adult the content possibly is in the actual recorded music. They also wanted the printing of warning labels, and they wanted lyrics on the covers, which was very tricky because this was when albums were transitioning from vinyl album to cassette tapes, where printing the lyrics on a cassette would be very troublesome. They would have to have some kind of fold-out accordion type sleeve or something. So it wasn't very practical. Placing albums with explicit covers under front checkout counters. And up to that point, a lot of stores would actually put them in plastic bags, or they would strategically place stickers on albums that may have adult covers, which wasn't really something that happened a lot. It happened a couple times, but it wasn't like there were a lot of artists releasing albums with explicit covers. Pressuring stations not to play explicit songs. And the problem with this is they weren't defining what makes a quote-unquote explicit song. We're not talking about songs that were obscene from a legal standpoint. These were not songs that met the criteria of the Miller test. These are not songs that were considered indecent. They were not pushed back till after 10 o'clock at night. Casey Kasem was counting them down every Sunday afternoon because I'd listened to him my entire childhood. So these aren't songs that are considered indecent from a legal standpoint. So they don't meet the criteria of the Pacifica test. So they were trying to create a new definition for what makes explicit songs, but they weren't providing any real definition as to what that means. Reassessing the contracts of musicians who perform violently or sexually in concerts. Now we're talking about blocking, possibly blocking musicians. And creating a panel to set what they called industry standards for musicians and the content of their music. And this is where it got to be very dangerous and began to attract the attention of a lot of musicians because they were afraid that there would be this panel, this government appointed panel, that would start setting standards as to what was considered appropriate music and what was not. And again, the problem with that is there was no governing guideline. There was no definition for what is considered explicit. And a lot of artists were very worried about what is, what we've talked about before as a chilling effect, that artists would be afraid to express themselves freely because they might get in trouble or they might get their music banned, not sold in stores, not played on the radio. So this was very troublesome to a lot of musicians. And in 1985, 1986, there was a series of congressional hearings. And basically, it was just the PMRC going to Congress to say, we want to create new guidelines and new standards and to kind of put into motion laws that would create this panel that would establish these rules. And so they had the women who were involved in the PMRC testified, Tipper Gore, Susan Baker, and the other two women, other supporters of the PMRC, several congressional leaders who were in favor of creating this board. And then they talked to several musicians, and they brought in these three gentlemen. And I don't know if you know who these guys are. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. This is Dee Snider, who was the lead singer of Twisted Sister, the We're Not Gonna Take It band. This gentleman in the middle was Mr. Frank Zappa, who was one of the single most brilliant musicians, I think, that lived in the last 100 years. And his thing was creating some of the most complexly written music you've ever heard, and then putting the silliest, most juvenile lyrics on top of it as his attempt to kind of create a blur between high art and low art. Some of his later stuff I wasn't such a big fan of because it was a little too juvenile and kind of sexist, but his early stuff with the Mothers of Invention is just absolutely brilliant. And then this gentleman right here is Mr. John Denver. And for those of you who don't know who John Denver was a country/folk singer. His biggest track, biggest hit, I guess, was a song called Rocky Mountain High. He was Mr. Wholesome. He was Mr. Good Old Boy. And what was interesting about these hearings is obviously Mr. Glam Rocker is going to come out against the PMRC. Frank Zappa had been fighting authority his entire career. The Mother's first record came out in 1966, and he was bashing authority then. So obviously 20 years later, he was very outspoken against the PMRC. But there were several congressional leaders who thought that John Denver would be the person who would be in favor of the PMRC. And what is interesting is his speech was the exact opposite, and it's incredibly well stated. And so normally when I teach this in class, I also play his speech. Well, I've included the links right here, and I've included the one for Frank Zappa as well. Zappa ended up testifying for about half an hour. I only want you to listen to the first part of this. This is a shorter clip. Starting about 4 minutes in, I want you to listen to him because he pulls no punches. He's very direct. He's very biting. Some great analogies. The thing about Zappa was he was an incredibly intelligent man. People kind of underestimated how smart he was because of how dumb some of his music was, at least lyrically. And so he really went after him. And then the John Denver speech, which is the second link here, is really incredibly well crafted, and it was basically due to John Denver coming out so heavily against the PMRC that was pretty much the beginning of the end, because they realized, well, good old boy John Denver is against this because he says basically this is censorship, that we're going to allow other people to dictate the worth of our art. And so that is basically a form of prior restraint. And a lot of people began to realize that he was absolutely right. So the PMRC did get their rating system. They didn't get their panel to oversee um, music that's being released in stores and music that's being played on the air or anything like that. What they did end up with was this. This is the last reminder of the PMRC for those who still buy music, which it's getting harder and harder to actually physically buy music on CD or on albums. This is the sticker that they started putting on uh, records that were flagged for having adult content. And then they would let the retailers decide whether or not that they would sell these to minors. And I know stores like Walmart and Kmart and places like that oftentimes did not even carry albums with this sticker on it. Or if they did, they would not sell to anyone without a parent or guardian. Most other record stores, especially the indie stores, they didn't care. But this was kind of the last little reminder of the PMRC. So if you ever wondered where these stickers came from, this is pretty much where they came from. They came from the PMRC, and the PMRC, they stuck around for a few more years, but they never really made a big stink again as far as trying to make sweeping changes in recording music. And like I said, to this day, music is the only major form of entertainment that we have that doesn't have a rating system, and I still think that's kind of interesting. So I know you're all really busy, but I hope you get a chance to look at these links that I included. Again, the two songs, just the Mary Jane Girl song is just so ridiculous that it's on any kind of list of naughty music or what they call porn rock, because there's nothing pornographic about it, and there's really nothing pornographic about the Sheena Easton song as well. So I like to play those examples because they're incredibly so dated. I mean, they're so 80. You can't. It's hard to think of a more 80s song than those two. Uh, and then also just the ridiculousness that was considered pornographic at the time. It just kind of gives you an idea of how subjective that term is, when it comes to what people consider to be pornography. It truly is a subjective term, which is why it has no legal bearing. And we talked about that when we were doing our section on obscenity. And then also, if you get a chance to watch the two clips with Frank Zappa and with John Denver, because they really express themselves very differently from one another, but very effectively as well. And so, again, that kind of shut down the PMRC. So anyway, that's the end of the last online lecture. If you have any questions about it, feel free to ask. And that's it. Thanks for listening.